Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy.
Hello, and welcome back to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy and narrative. I am Steve Vormosi, your host, and I am joined today by Jonathan E. Manzer.
Completely a social construct.
And Scott Thurlow.
Merely a literary construct.
And today we are discussing a chapter of a book called The Sage Handbook of Social Research Methods. And the chapter is called Analyzing Narratives and Storytelling by, this is going to be terrible, but Matti Hirvonen.
Good enough.
I think it's fairly close. I hope it's fairly close. Matti, if you are watching, please let us know.
Correct us for sure.
If we're wrong. Anyway, this is a chapter about narrative and storytelling, so I believe that Ian has a short little aside for us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
It's an anecdote and a narrative. So I am a linguistics master's student at CUNY Graduate Center, and I work IT there. One of my coworkers is a doctoral candidate in English literature, which is why I'm bringing this up now. He's been doing that for 5 years, so he's quite studied, and we get into conversations. I mean, linguistics, English literature have a lot to do with each other. We like to talk a lot about quantum physics.
Sweet.
but also about like literary theory. So we got into a conversation about Derrida, which I didn't know much about besides that one article we did.
We briefly covered up.
Difference.
And I mean, beyond that, like I kind of know pop culture who Derrida is, if he is popular culture at all, but
Some kind of culture.
yeah, with not extensive. And I was informed quite a bit. And again, this is all from his point of view. I don't know much more beyond that. He was talking about he's Dutch. He grew up there. And I went to school in Ireland for his university, and then came over for his doctoral program in the United States, and in continental Europe, or at least in like where he grew up in. When he was studying literature, and also in Ireland, Derrida had no presence. But when he got to the U.S., Derrida's everywhere, and it shocked him.
Dog.
And he's more of an objective. He takes a more objective look at literary critique, where Derrida is all about social constructs, and he argues that if you take Derrida to kind of the logical extent, critique is meaningless because it is whatever the reader is inputting into it, and there's no objective truth. So I brought up Frege, which is because I come from when I studied philosophy at Rutgers, it was very analytical, very Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein.
Mm-hmm.
So I come from that school of thought, and he is too, and that's why he likes talking to linguists, because linguists are very analytical people. And so I was talking about sense and reference, and how I believe an objective look at was written in books. And my friend here says, well, you don't want to bring up those ideas up into the literature department here, because this branch of Derridians will punch you in the face. And I said, branch Derridians? I thought they were all killed in Waco, Texas.
But pow!
See, I can do referential humor too.
Yes, that is nailed it. That is very nice on many levels, indeed.
So yeah, that's my anecdote.
Well done, sir. I suppose at this point we should probably go into the article. So this is an article, as I mentioned before, talking about analyzing narratives and storytelling. There is fairly early on, it gets into discussing the three narrative turns, which I think is what a lot of this chapter is about. And I want to get into discussing them, but I guess in the intro here, we talk about so there's a section of it that says the use of narratives in social research may be characterized by three separate but by no means straightforwardly successive
I have that
movements
as well. Yes,
and as we go into it, this article talks about how we or the times that we talk about these and what they are exactly. And Scotty, I think that you talked about this earlier when I mentioned to you. Would you like to discuss what those three are?
Certainly, yes. So he points out that, well, I'll back up a quick bit before I go into that, because that is the sort of his start of his argument. He's pointing out, like, here are the three turns and viewed through each of these angles, etc. But there was a line I picked out earlier that I liked, because sort of introducing, before he even comes into three terms, he writes, many scholars simply repeat Aristotle's characterization of a good tragedy having a beginning, middle, and end. For open or artistic narratives, this is a far too compelling formula, emphasizing the clear sequence of events. But on the other hand, the terms are far too broad to reveal anything fundamental in the nature of what narratives actually do. So basically the problem is, like, the way it's been studied thus far, like, has been either too broad to do anything about, or like too structuralist, so nobody deviates from studying it this way.
Right.
So the three terms he points out that traditionally were literary, historiography, and social sciences. Right. So like one's like just the text itself, pretty much, and then historiography is like, the sort of context and when and where something a narrative was told or written or put forth in some sense. And then the social sciences, of course, are like the newest and more like postmodern-ish sort of angle. We sort of like look at it as a whole, like bits of both. And I think that's basically the argument that he's going for to build up upon, is that we need to look at it in all of these angles, not just through one lens of each, as they were three separate branches before, but now like sort of are converging. So sorry, you were about to jump in?
I was saying that the social object is to look specifically for a interpretation of the text as you in the scope you want it.
Right, in your own subjective terms, kind of.
I want to look at Macbeth through gender. I want to look at the racial aspects in Othello, and it's only looking in a lot of ways. Then one of the critiques of it is it ignores all the others,
right? Exactly,
because it's only looking for. It's almost, and one of also, from what I understand from my friends in this field, it's that people, impart their own viewpoints,
impart their own narratives
not necessarily
onto
the intent of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting to look at these three ways of understanding narrative and trying to parse them out. I honestly, for me, and full disclosure, I'm the one that found this article, and I wish that I had read more of this book, because I felt a little adrift at certain parts of it.
Sure.
But I think that what does come through in this is the fact that there are these different ways of trying to figure out what you're looking at in terms of like when you read a narrative, and like the just looking at it through in terms of like the literal definition of the narrative is one thing. And that was like, I think what this says is that was big in the 60s, or like up through the 60s.
It was like a vague time frame of how they were being studied through each.
It's actually a historical narrative over how these progressed throughout. So if you're interested in learning or picking out, I guess, forerunners of different aspects of this work does it very well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to, so I'm going to probably skip a little bit ahead. So we go through the notion of narrative. And I don't know if you guys have anything to talk about in this section.
I mean, just a brief thing, just one quick thing, because like we said, it's the three turns is basically his intro. He sets that up, and then as defined, like how they were traditionally done is like more of a structuralist study, as you were just saying, versus a theoretical postmodern developments, which is the social like sciences aspect you were saying. So like you just said, it basically is a quick time frame of here are the works important to one and how they started evolving, developing, and then we come to what you're about to cover, I think, Steevo.
Oh, I don't know what you thought I was about to cover. You mean going into the next section?
I thought you were going to cover something bold and insightful.
Well,
go. As
it turns out, the next section is narratives before narrative analysis, and like I think that there's some interesting stuff in here. The very beginning of it just says many kinds of narratives were used as research material long before any narrative analysis, and I think that says something to like how people viewed these before there was like the
idea of study,
the scholarship of narrative, right? Like, and it kind of talks about, you know, what narratives meant to people before you got into breaking things down and like figuring out what the and later on figuring out what the social constructs around the narrative were. Especially in like an individual way, as we were mentioning precast, but there's a line in here that I'm trying to find right now, but so it's talking about this work. The Polish peasant demonstrates the power of individual story for the sociological imagination. The belief in the factual, referential transparency of these documents of life is tangible, while the authors read the letters as illustrations of attitudes, life situations, or their own conclusions, where it's kind of talking about, like, you read this as, I guess, like, kind of an individual, and you kind of take your own...
Wasn't the Polish Peasants about a collection of, like, letters and works?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think they're talking about there... a bit about how narrative's not just works that we read, but we have narrative every aspect of our life.
Yes.
So,
I have a stake with that. It is that, right? So, like, the line I had picked out that's sort of encapsulates that is he writes, in the modern world in which we all live, identity is a life story. So, like, that sort of, like, ties into how they were analyzing the letters and papers and so forth, and then how they were, like, sort of projecting some of their own constructs onto it, but while trying to ostensibly be as objective as possible and quote unquote analyzing these letters like through a sensible historical perspective.
Aren't all of our memories just narratives as well?
Yes. I believe that he points that out too. Later on as well. But yeah, that's the general idea for that.
Absolutely.
Section.
And I mean, I don't know if I have too much more to say about that section. I don't know if anybody else has anything to mention?
The next thing I have to mention is in the section or two after that. So,
well, the next section is about the narrative turns, and I think that, you know, that's a big part of what, or basically exactly kind of what this chapter is about. And Scott, you mentioned earlier it's the literary, the historiography, and
social sciences. Yes,
the social sciences. Damn social sciences.
Take it easy.
But I think that, you know, we can go and try and look at any narrative in terms of any of these three, and you're going to come up with a wildly, like, vastly different reading of them. Which
maybe not, but certainly a more narrow reading in any case. You know what I mean? I think that's one of the points of this article or this chapter.
Yeah, but I also agree with Steevo on that. Maybe it's not the point of the chapter there. My narrative memory of this work is pretty weak, but where's the point I was just making? What did you say?
I was saying you can take different reading based on the narrative turn that you're.
Oh yeah, if you're doing
exploring,
if you want to look at. So I remember actually when I was back in college, I did The Secret Sharer by Jessica Conrad, and we had to pick a narrative type to do a paper on, and then we had to do a second one through a different viewpoint of it, and they're completely different papers with completely different outlooks.
I'm not saying
because here's the thing is, actually, I just heard on the radio they were talking about Huckleberry Finn,
yes,
and the backlash against it for its racial components, which completely ignores the historical components of it. But so you could have it's the same work, but with two totally different.
Yeah, I'm not saying you cannot have wildly different interpretations depending on which angle / narrative turn in quotes you take. I'm just saying they might not be mutually exclusive, but certainly they. My argument is, at least what I extracted as well on top of that, is that because there's such a narrow range, it's almost inevitable to get only one single interpretation, which is probably going to be different than others.
Right.
It might not be, but it probably will be because you're focusing on such a narrow aspect of study.
Well, I guess it really depends on like kind of what school of thought you.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
adhere to, right?
Roland Barthes would have the braid, so that you can actually combine all of them.
Right,
yeah. They're all slapped together. Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's one of the things that I have picked up my notes that comes up like I said, after this one.
But it's weird in retrospect. /Z has a lot more meaning for me nowadays than it did back when
Originally, yeah. So, well, maybe that's the genius of Barthes, we'll say.
Well, that is it's actually in this section. I don't know if that's what you were going to talk about, but
a little after that, but it's near and around. Yeah,
when the Roland Barthes famous passage has been used to characterize the ubiquity of narrative, and it says, and Roland Barthes says, able to be carried by articulate. This is his
quote.
This is how he describes narrative. Able to be carried by articulated language, spoken or written, fixed or moving images, gestures, and the ordered mixture of all these substances. Narrative is present in myth, legend, fable, tale, novella, epic, history, tragedy, drama, comedy, mime, painting.
Stained glass windows.
Listen, leave mime alone, all right? You guys, painting, stained glass windows, cinema, comics, news item, conversation,
and so on.
And that's what he says about it. It's kind of the idea that narrative is present in pretty much every kind of
every facet of life ever. Sure.
Conversation, and I think that so he brings us up in the section about the narrative turns, and it's like, yeah, these are all types of narratives, but how do we view them? I guess, like, how do we understand them? And it all has to do with the narrative turns, and I think right in the beginning, he's talking about. There is an accepted one turn, but he thinks that there's three or something like that. I don't exactly remember right now off the top of my head. I shouldn't be saying that. But I think that was the case. And the fact that he's trying to break this down into like separate turns and ways that, you know, as readers of narrative and as understanders or, you know, receivers of narrative, we have decided to break these things down, and like these different thought processes have come into play, I think is really interesting. And you have the literal at first, and then you have the take it in terms of history, and then you have it taken in terms of like basically your individual understanding of what's going on. Is kind of fascinating. I really want to dig more into this, and I think this kind of gives like a general overview. Like this chapter of this book gives kind of a general overview of the ways that you can do that. But I would love to see somebody dig more into that, or alternatively, right now where we're at, I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on like different ways that you can view narrative.
Well, I think there are myriad, as they sort of point out.
Sure.
So, like, I don't know if we want to cover all of them, but I think, of course, because of everything you just said, because it encapsulates so much, as we said, it's like an ingrained part of human interaction. That's such a broad thing that basically every interaction will be a narrative, and any like record of a narrative or of an interaction will also be a narrative, and you can study them as all the ways we just said. Cody.
I disagree with that, and I agree with the second part of what you said for it's the record, but it's not. So I'm going to use my linguistics background for this.
All right, hit us.
I like Aristotle's beginning, middle, and end, even though the fair points against it, because here's the thing is, when you look at human speech, it's not just taken as a whole. There are different, like, you have the syntactic, the structure of it. You have the phonological expression, the vocal expressions of it. You have the semantic interpretations of it. You have all of these different subsects of it. Narrative has that backbone as well. And again, I'm going more towards the analytical side of things. We have no room for feelings here. Narrative is an inherently retrospective creation. It starts with an end point, and it is looking back at chains of events that lead to that end point. There's a beginning point, which is the natural, in a sense, backward conclusion to where it should begin. You don't want to give information before the beginning,
right? No,
because it's unnecessary. And even if like a prelude exists, which is before the beginning prior, it still has some tangential relevance to the.
You're right.
And the thing is, narratives differ because I could say, well, A is the ending here because that's the beginning point of it. That it goes B, C, and C is the beginning. You might say, no, that's not true. It's actually A, B, C, D, and then, and maybe we'll disagree on the different
details
points that need to be hit.
Sure.
Or the depth of how far we should look into for this narrative. But I think whether you're dealing with a joke, whether you're dealing with a tragedy, whether you're dealing with any narrative, unless you're forming the narrative as the event is going on, which you don't know the ending to. So if you are, let's say, the news trying to come up with, here's how I expect the ending to be. So I'm going to, but prior to that, determine what A, B, and, or what C, B, how it leads to A. But I think that, again, it all starts with the ending. And that's my structural. How you regard the semantics of what each thing means in the long run can be done later. But that's just the structure.
So I will say,
I don't know if that makes sense.
This kind of leads into the next section because you sound Proppian in your a little bit Proppian in your
I didn't get that far in the reading.
You absolutely did. It's like the third page. But no. This is the one where it's like, hold on, let me read this. Prop takes a remarkable variety of actions and condenses them to basic functions.
Oh yeah, that does sound like me.
Prop intended a bottom-up, empirical, and strictly inductive approach in the study of the tales, the reception of the Wonder Tales, which is a Russian
We're reading Prop.
construct. Yeah, we got to check him out. However,
Props to Prop.
the reception of the book in the French discussion of the early 1960s turned this project upside down. As a consequence, the model was primarily used in a top-down way, trying to fit parts of whatever narratives into Wonder Tale categories. The merit of the model is to suggest that well-established cultural genres may privilege certain categories of agents, repertoires of actions, and processes.
Oh, I imagine that's true. I like this guy a lot.
Seems like
I read this paper.
like you're intrigued.
We're going to check him out. So we go from Prop to Labov.
Hey, Labov.
And
linguistics.
I know you know a little bit about Labov, Ian. You've read him. He's a linguistics guy.
Sociolinguistics.
Yep, I do have a note. It says this is for E. It's like the note I have in the margins in this section.
So I'm gonna read this part from here. Emerging from the linguistic discourse,
that's the one I picked out to go.
The model provided social research with one of the first tools to approach the studied narratives in a detailed way. Textually, the model offered clear criteria to recognize narrative and recognize its difference from other forms of talk. In parentheses, description, argument, or question. So, this is interesting. It's a way to differentiate actual narrative from conversation, I guess. where narrative is kind of a story being told to, we'll call it conversation, I guess, for this conversation, it's which is, discussion, questions, questions and answers, things like that.
Questions and answers are because that's all dealing with common ground and saying that I don't possess information A. I think that you possess information A. And then there's like a whole politeness thing which I expect you to
provide information
A in an honest fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And so on and so forth. I mean, like, there's no, like, narrative possesses a whole different, I don't know if conversation I would consider narrative, because that's more of a comparison of different sets of knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, so this model was, from what I got from this article, was considered a very narrow reading, and
well, we should read Labov as well.
well, let's see. Let's see what they have here. Let's see what Mati has
Just
here.
all for the narrow ranges.
The model, strictly based on clause-level narrative sequence, was all too narrow to capture the complex narration so typical in interview situations. This seems to lead to a marginalization in the model of other aspects, such as place, by rendering it only as a static element of orientation. But from life stories to fiction, place may have a much more central and constructive role in narrative. So it's from this, it seems like, and again, I have not read any Labov, so my entire understanding of this model is these 5 paragraphs or whatever. Yeah, basically. But it seems like he is focused on kind of making the place important in terms of narrative, and so you. Ian, I actually I know you have limited knowledge of him as well, but perhaps more than me.
No, actually, I'm quite familiar with Labov, although I didn't know him at all delving into narrative.
In terms of narrative?
Most of the work I'm familiar with is, as I mentioned, precast about Martha's Vineyard, and how he looked into the different speech of different classes on there. But also he did New York, how like the lower class in New York versus the upper class, and where they thought, where different segments perceive different words to come from. And I know him as like a strict, like, here's how societies use language, not like different words, not how they form narrative. But obviously he did. But
that's really fascinating that you say that, because in those 2 examples you just gave, place is very important in both of them.
Absolutely.
So it seems like that is the discussion that's happening here in this section, is he is managing language in terms of, especially narrative language, in terms of place.
And like what the importance factor is on that,
right?
Pretty much.
And I
would say that's very much part of his overall thesis,
right?
Of his work.
Yeah. So those are two models that we have to go on: Labov and Prope, I believe is how
sure.
I'm assuming is how his name is pronounced. I don't know why I said I believe. I have no outside reference to that other than what I read here. But that takes us from text to narrative practice. And Scott, you have not spoken too much. I don't know if you have anything.
No.
Recently, I will say you got your.
No, well, I was waiting for, like, there's one big idea that I thought was quite interesting, but it's not quite in this section yet. So I've been waiting on that one, because, like, this stuff is, like, sort of fine. Like, he mentions the models, like you guys just said, but this one was like, this section was sort of filler to me.
Okay.
It's just more like, outlaying like what he just said.
Well, that's fine. Let's talk about what you want to talk about.
All right. So like he goes through that, but the next
I'm
section
here now.
after that, we're going to talk about this.
Jesus. Sorry.
This is something we mentioned too. I think like just all of us as again students of linguistics and narrative, and some of us way more professionally than others. But there's an idea that he brings up is the quote unquote master narrative, sort of the equation that underlies and informs all other narratives in life. So like it's almost like a Jungian idea, which we've sort of tossed around here and there, where like there's some kind of like core intrinsic narrative that every human on earth has or contains therein that somehow like then sort of bleeds out or like trickles out into all possible narratives that everybody can perform and tell and recall.
Well, that's going back to what I'm saying, though, in a way that if the framework exists, then it's instinctively you structure your narratives in the same way
As
I do.
such, yeah.
We just may disagree on the semantic details that go into each of the stories.
Sure. So like he doesn't say that he like buys into this idea, like that he agrees that a master narrative in quotes indeed exists, just that it's been bandied about as a possible theory to explore and a microscope in which to study narrative. But of course, like nobody can say for sure if that is the case. It's just that if you take that angle, I do like the idea of it because I do actually tend to agree that might be like there's sort of like some prototype narrative that isn't inherent in consciousness to some degree.
Sure. Well, there's the I don't know if it's a theory per se, but like there's the idea, right, that there are 7 stories in the world, and
true.
like every story is a child of one of those stories, basically.
Yeah. So you mentioned quantum physics just offhandedly at the beginning, but it's something like that. What is the equation that runs like the universe? What is the equation that runs quote unquote like narrative, like capital N, I guess we'll say, right?
Yeah.
So like if indeed that equation exists, which is an open question, of course, at least I would say, but I think it's possible that it does. We just haven't found it yet. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I don't know if we haven't found it yet. I think that I think that every story is based on like if you adhere to that idea that every story is based on one of those 7 or precursor less. Stories, sure, or whatever it is. I think it's 7, maybe 6, whatever it is. Then we found the equation, right? We're just like, everybody's just working off of that, whether or not you consciously realize
that.
It.
Sure.
You're working off of one of those stories because those are the stories that you have understood since you knew what a story was.
Yeah, you almost can't help it because that structure is already in place.
In that way, you're working on the structure, as you're talking about, Ian, you're working on the structure that stories go by, whether or not you understand it or not.
Yeah.
So I actually like comedy quite a bit, although I am not funny at any means, and I have no sense of humor. Shut up. But there's rules to comedy that like things are funny, 3 times, but not 4 times, that kind of thing. That there are general. People can break some of these rules, but you can make a joke until it's keep saying it until it's not funny, and then keep talking until it
circles
returns
back
to being
around.
funny.
But you have to know the rule to break it. Is probably what you're going to say. Yeah.
Exactly. So, like, there could be a framework to what makes something funny, and it may not be like I don't know, because when I always heard that like there's 7 stories, like it kind of always rang. It's like they didn't understand what they meant, or the way they described it, they didn't understand what they meant by that. I'm not saying that you were saying that. I'm just saying that in general when I heard it prior to it. But is there a structure to tragedy? Is there a structure to comedy? Is there a structure to like being polite, having polite conversation? Likely. And like, is it because it's a son or daughter to a grander story, or is it because there's genetically a framework that we find
that's
this type of story sad?
I think it's an open question, but I think there's something to be said for some angles of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot to be said for, like, there are certainly frameworks that just work. Like that we did a 7-part series on Hero with 1,000 Faces, which is all about I know you've blocked that out of your memory at this point, but
It was part of his own hero's journey.
which was all about structuring
the framework of a story.
structuring epic
Sure.
stories, right? And like yes, that structure still exists. And what keeps stories interesting in my mind is the people that understand that and build off of it. Take it, break the rules a little bit, or take it in a different direction than it has been and
Sure.
it's gone previously. Things like that. I think that is what crafting a good narrative is really about, is understanding what has gone before. And yes, there are things that there's a way to tell a story, for sure. You know, whether it's a comedy or a tragedy or whatever it is, or you're talking to a guy on the train. Like,
There's a way to be romantic, although I haven't figured that one out yet.
Like, you'll get there.
You understand it academically, but not practically.
See, that's the problem. You're not thinking with your heart.
Anyway,
So
Which doesn't make any goddamn sense.
it doesn't. No, but so here's an interesting thing, and this goes to actually it's not interesting at all, but I'm going to say it anyway. I was learning to develop parsing techniques for computers on sentences, and so theoretically we can put in as many adjectives prior to a noun that we want. However, you don't have to program that into a computer, because in natural language there's a finite amount that people will choose to ever use that, unless they're trying to make a point of just attaching things to it. And even if you aren't there, I think it's 7 max, that because there's a
magic
Adjectives?
adjectives that, like, because you do, I forget what order they go in, quantifier, color, or whatever the thing is.
Color, shape,
Yeah, but
size.
theoretically,
whatever.
you can go on infinitely if you so chose. Like, there's also the he said that she thought that he walked. And you can go on forever with that kind of thing as well. But again, in natural language, even though it's possible, we don't do it. So I wonder how
deep
again,
that goes. Like why that.
but
is
even
the
in
case.
narrative, that's like we can do a lot of things with. But it's just, I think it's an instinctual thing. That it's not born. It's just what's easiest for us to tell a story. Versus because the human brain can only process so much information at once. So if you tell too long of a story, people zone out.
Mhm.
Just like the people who are watching this
Wake up.
have already
Okay, bye.
Out there.
out there. But again, I think knowing all these aspects of like cognitive kind of aspects of language and all that, there's a finite to what we can actually do, even though
So
it's
it only
infinite
works so many ways.
impossibility.
Even though the ways in which you can combine them.
But here's the thing, but also it only works a finite number of ways, because that's the most optimal path
Of why it's
working,
of basically survival,
Right.
if you will, or at
And
least communication.
Well, I will say this. I'm not sure that narrative always takes the most optimal path, but sometimes that is... So, like, it's interesting. Like, sometimes that is appreciated by a certain segment of people, right? Like, and maybe for them it's the most optimal path. The thing is, like, you have an audience at all times when you're telling a narrative, right? And, like...
What?
When you're, I'm sorry, you coughed. when you're putting forth a narrative, you have an audience. That's the entire point of a narrative. Is like it's you have somebody who's listening or reading or whatever, and they are not all the same, right? So you're either trying to hit
A broad enough swath
specific,
between them.
like you're trying to either hit specific segments either in your own, I guess for an artist, preferably in their own mind, they're trying to hit the things that they think are resonant with them, and if they are tuned in to the way that the rest of society or a segment, whatever segment of society they're trying to appeal to works, they will tap the specific rules that work for that segment of society. The thing is that everybody works slightly differently, so you have like slightly different rules for every single person. So you're trying to basically aggregate
yeah, I know.
the rules and hit the center mark on a wildly moving target of like who your audience is, what their specific interests are at that time, what their specific interests are at the time, what their their attention span is at the time, things like that. And like that I think plays a lot into I'm sorry, I'm losing you. That plays a lot into kind of how your narrative works for anybody, for
Sure.
a specific segment, whoever you're talking to.
I just want to say we lost Pam, who is sitting out in the audience. I could see
Our number one Pam is here.
And you've
And-
lost even her.
I feel like she's fallen asleep at this point. She just woke up to laugh at our joke because we mentioned her, and
Or
she's
just at you.
very uncomfortable right now.
Anyways.
I think that's all interesting. I unfortunately don't think we have any answers.
No, I've never had any.
I just wanted to
answers.
bring up that question because he brought it up in the article and like to see what you guys thought of it. And that was very entertaining.
Yeah.
Was it?
Well, it's all relative, of course. Everyone's narrative and everyone's reaction to such narrative is different, as we just laid out.
Exactly. I think we went pretty far afield on this, but
Well,
I appreciated the last segment of this episode more than the first because we were sticking very close to text earlier, and
Breaking all the rules.
this
of narrative.
has been a fun conversation towards the end for me. I don't know if you guys appreciated it, but I did. But to
No, it's been a good conversation. I agree a lot with what you said. I think you could have been more concise. If we do this episode again, you could.
You got to follow the rules more closely next time.
I'm working on my material right now.
He's saying your B and your C were too long. Your A and D are like fine. Pretty much.
But
I would have cut out C0 and C1.
Yeah.
And,
You had too many subsections, but
oh, I'm sorry, you were throwing to me. But
I thought you were just gonna like wrap up or like follow like the last.
that's exactly what I'm
Because
going
I
to
do
do.
have one
yeah.
more thing for the final, the article's actual conclusion.
The second narrative turn. Is that the
No,
section you're in?
The very last one, like
That's the last section.
Then yes,
Is a second narrative turn.
yeah.
Oh, references.
Yes.
Please.
So like basically, all right. If we're going to encapsulate this article, like to go back on track a little bit, is that at least what I gathered from it is that the argument is, given everything he said to build up to it and all the narrative turns and everything we just talked about, just as there exists a broad spectrum of possible narratives, in quotes again, in life, in order to study those narratives, this requires a broad swath of doctrines and fields of analysis. So again, he starts out with saying like how it originally was sort of more narrow. There was this angle, this angle, this angle, and each one stuck to its own angle and without like crossing over. But because it's so diverse, because the open question is, as we just said, is there a master narrative and how to use it, etc., how to permutate that. In order to study any of this stuff, narrative as a whole, again, as a concept, we must be able to encapsulate a lot of angles and sort of cross-reference them and not just stick to one or the other. And maybe that muddles it a little bit, but I think that creates the argument is, creates a richer, more diverse way of studying narrative and thinking about it.
Absolutely.
That's my conclusion.
Yeah, no, I agree with your conclusion of this
Or at least
conclusion.
from what I extracted from this article.
Yeah, I mean, so the chapter itself, the article itself, I thought was an interesting discussion on narrative, but left me with more questions than answers, I guess.
Maybe that was
Good.
the intent.
And if that was the intent,
It's a textbook.
good on you. So
Made you think at
exactly.
least.
You're not supposed to provide answers.
Exactly. So it was an interesting read, but I honestly much preferred the conversation that we've had tonight.
Let's analyze it later on after this.
Yeah,
As a narrative.
I'd be willing to continue talking about this later, but
All right.
in the meantime, unless anyone else has any final thoughts, Ian?
So, this is weird because while I didn't, the textbook view or the textbook reading of it was not necessarily dry. It was a narrative, but it was a historical narrative, as I mentioned earlier. So it did spark some thoughts within my head, and we had a decent conversation here. So I would recommend this. I'd recommend other works, but I mean, it's probably a good launching point.
Yes, I was going to say, it's a good springboard.
Find other works to read.
You could do worse.
Your specific subset of interests in critiquing. And if you're into social constructs, though, you're wrong. It's all objectivity.
You heard it here first.
The intention of the author, written at the time, and art does not grow over time. It is static. It's
and stable, and unchanging and unflinching forever.
A spatial temporal static product.
Gotcha.
Welcome to our next episode, which is going to be us arguing about this.
To be continued.
I guess another static spatial temporal.
Yes. It's all subjective, of course. Find out next time. So I think we're going to cut it off here.
Thank God.
Yeah.
This narrative is over, my friends.
I have
to ended 10 minutes ago.
I need another drink and a cigarette, and
certainly what you need.
We're gonna call it quits. So this has been the Lost Signals Discusses Philosophy and Narrative. I have been your host, Steve Ramosi, joined tonight by Jonathan Ian Manzer.
It's certainly been a discussion.
And Scott Thurlow.
And go analyze yourself. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Lost Signals Discusses Philosophy, Narrative, and the Mechanics of Criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.